This week, it's Risk Management Monday. In our first interview, we welcome Sumedh Thakar, CEO at Qualys, to discuss why closing CISO-CEO communication gap requires a common business language. In our second interview, we welcome Jeff Recor, president at Recor Risk Consulting, to share his risk management insights, what CEOs and boards really need. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Your customers' and employees' identities are your responsibility to keep safe. But who is helping you stay safe from identity-based threats? Identity is the key to getting security right. And with the right identity partner, so much more is possible for your business than you thought. From strengthening cybersecurity to increasing revenue to reducing inefficiencies and costs, Okta unlocks growth and new possibilities for its customers. Go to securityweekly.com/Okta to learn more about Okta and the company's commitment to leading the fight against identity attacks. Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides end-to-end lifecycle protection for cloud-native application environments. It empowers organizations to safeguard their APIs, serverless functions, containers, and Kubernetes environments. Panoptica ensures comprehensive cloud security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, offering deep visibility, contextual risk assessments, and actionable remediation insights for all your cloud assets. Get more information at securityweekly.com/Panoptica. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 357, recorded July 22nd, 2024. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me remotely for this show today are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, how you doing, Matt? Listen, I'm excited. 2 days until training camp for my Patriots.
Yeah.
We're about to get down in the NFL again, my friend.
I just hope you weren't too busy this weekend doing recovery work.
We were busy. We were definitely busy, no doubt about it. It was an exciting weekend.
Yeah, I bet. Also joining from the great state of Texas, Mr. Ben Carr. Welcome, Ben.
Hey Matt, how you doing this fine rainy Monday? It's nice that it finally cooled off a little bit here. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just for people who know Texas a little bit. It's raining in July. Like, how crazy is that? Like, I haven't seen rain in July in 2 summers, Ben.
I dealt with a lot of rain last week. Travel issues for me earlier in the week just due to weather, but then later the CrowdStrike stuff. Luckily, I did not get swept up in that.
Yeah, luckily. All right, you're invited to InfoSec World 2024 at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort in Lake Buena Vista, Florida, from September 23rd to the 25th. Join top cybersecurity experts for this premier event. Save 25% on your pass by using code ISW24-SW25 when you register at securityweekly.com/InfoSec World 2024. Don't miss out on this exclusive opportunity. As CEO of Qualys, Sumedh Thakar leads the company's vision, strategic direction, and implementation. He joined Qualys in 2003 in engineering and grew within the company, taking various leadership roles focused on helping Qualys deliver on its platform vision. Since 2014, he has served as Chief Product Officer at Qualys, where he oversaw all things product, including engineering, development, product management, cloud operations, DevOps, and customer support. A product fanatic and engineer at heart, he is driving force behind expanding the platform from vulnerability management into broader areas of security and compliance. We've covered some of those on the show, helping customers consolidate their security stack. Sumedh, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Matt, thank you for having me. It's always fun to have talked to you and your crew. And Ben, hello. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So a little history for everybody. I was at Qualys. Sumedh and I worked together. I might have actually worked for you right before I left. Actually, I think during that '09 to 12 period. I mean, you were working on PCI, I was working on policy compliance, so we have a lot of history together.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So this interview stems from an article we covered right before our RSA conference. On this show, our second segment is typically leadership and communication. And so I like to cover a lot of articles around board communication, help CISOs really understand what CEOs and boards are looking for. You and Richard Sierson, who's also has a lot of history with both of us, was in that article as well. I think he's your chief trust officer now.
Yeah, he's the chief risk technology officer, so he helps us with kind of the risk equation and the technologies we use around that.
Yeah, and in that article, you talked about the CEO CISO gap and talked about a need for a common language. And as we were covering the article, I said, I said, I love this article, right? Because we agree, all three of us on the show agree, security is a risk management problem. And one of the things the article didn't get into enough details around was what should CISOs be doing to better communicate to the CEO and the board. So I said, why don't you come on and tell us, Ahmed? So that's kind of the basis for this interview segment.
Yeah, it was an interesting follow-up conversation we had on that one. So, I think this is an area I feel pretty passionately about, especially since I made that transition and I took over as the CEO. So I look at this risk management and especially cyber from the business lens as well as understanding the technology and the technical aspect of it and how we talk about it, how we sell and I think that gave me a very interesting different perspective when you're putting cyber in the context of the bigger business.
Yeah. And that's what I want to drill into a little bit because I think it's interesting. You have some really good stories from your own experience as CEO and communicating with your board. But before we get into some of those examples, when I think about the CISO role and its kind of transformation over the years, I mean, look, CISOs can come from various backgrounds. A lot of them do come out of the technical side. We have had a lot of technical CISOs come in, but the challenge is for some of those is they think about metrics a little differently than a CEO. So, as a CEO, what do you want to tell CISOs you really care about? Like, how do you help them kind of bridge this gap on what they're used to talking to you about versus what they really should be talking to you about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't want Jonathan Trull, who's our CISO, to get carried away with what I'm going to say now. But the role of the CISO is not to prevent breaches, like stop every single breach that is out there. Like the and that's typically what everybody is trying to do is like, oh, I need to deploy all this technology, I need to do this, do that. And I think we are at the point where the the CISO has to, of course, leverage the best technology out there, have processes in place, but they need to be able to speak the business language in terms of, look, we say cyber risk. A lot of people don't talk about cyber and risk together in the same uh, sentence, even when the reality is what we do with cyber is a risk. And when you talk about risk, the first question that anybody has is how much. When you say, oh, I have some risk, just saying some risk is quantifying that risk. And a lot of times what I saw when I went into my board meeting as a CEO first time was the reporting to the audit committee, etc., was a lot more just around, oh, we have these many vulnerabilities and we have these many patches that we deployed, and then like there was a line item on we implemented two-factor authentication, and all of that signifies progress. But then the question from one of the board members was, well, what does that mean? You implemented two-factor authentication, what does that mean to the business? And there was no answer because did it make us 5 times safer? Would it make us 2 times safer? Did it make us 10 times safer? For the amount of investment that we make in cyber, how much of how is that investment helping the business? Was the first sort of conversation that I was like, yeah, I mean, as we focus on, like, of course, you should fix every issue, every vulnerability. The business and the board thinks of it from a bit of a different lens, right? Nobody, of course, wants to get compromised, but you also have to think of how much risk do you have, because without knowing how much risk you have, you don't know how much to spend on reducing that risk. And then that brings up the question, am I spending too much or too little? And this happened to me when a board member, somebody I know was a board member at a different company. He called me and said, "Hey, you understand cyber a little bit. How much should we be spending, right? How much should I?" And I said, "Well, how much is your risk?" And he said, "Okay, let me go back and ask." And then he came back and said, "Hey, they couldn't tell me how much risk do I have from my digital infrastructure." And I said, "Well, that's the main language that we first need to start speaking is how do we in some way quantify how much risk is cyber bringing to the business?" And this weekend was another great example of that analysis. And so to me, I feel like a lot of times this language of let me show the dashboards and the top tens and all of that is not what the business and the CEO or the board really are looking to understand.
So
So
I,
so
I
Sumedh,
was.
right?
You want to jump in, Jason? Or there's so
Yeah,
many things in there I want to unpack.
yeah. No, I was going to ask because to Matt's original point, so many CISOs right now were brought up through that technical engineering side of the aisle,
Right.
right? So what are the specific skills, competencies, and how can organizations or CEOs help develop these CISOs to become more business, have more business acumen, become more aligned with the business? Because, in certain aspects, we have CISOs who walk in the door who have the acumen, who can do it. But I think we have an obligation to start helping these CISOs move up that chain, get that seat at the table, help enable them to have that business acumen because it's just not going to happen organically. So, what do you recommend for competencies, skills, things CISOs can do who came from that technical root, that technical foundation? What are things they can be doing to sharpen their skills so they can have the right conversation with the CEO and the board?
That's a great question because at our user conference last year, when I talked about some of the need for the industry to focus on some form of risk quantification, um, I was I was telling people that everybody here is part of that bigger initiative by the business to reduce risk, right? Whether you are somebody who scans for vulnerabilities or your patches, you're part of that risk reduction. And I asked how many of you have the word risk in your title, and like 8 people out of 800 actually had the word risk in their title, and so they're not thinking risk. And one of the biggest things I have seen is a cultural change in the organization. Like you cannot just have the CISO thinking risk quantification. It's the person who's scanning for vulnerabilities, who was looking for patching, also has to develop this process of saying, I'm not being compensated on number of vulnerabilities I am discovering or how many patches I'm deploying. I have to ask the question, how much risk is this vulnerability causing or this misconfiguration causing? And if I apply this patch, how much risk am I reducing from a security perspective, but how much risk am I adding from an operational perspective? And operational risk, security risk, they go hand in hand many times, and which is the pull and the battle. And so I think to answer your question, it's more that people ask me a lot, what is the end state? And this is what Matt was also pushing me, saying, well, you didn't actually say what should exactly we should do. And I think I can give the end state. Generally, what people would like to see as a board member, as a business, is you want to say, here's my $500 million business a year. The risk, and here's like the 5 top risk, right? In some businesses, maybe reputational risk is not a big thing because these days nobody changes their provider because there is a breach, right? uh, Availability risk becomes number one. Non-compliance risk, like if I don't do this, I will not get a compliance certificate for FedRAMP, which means I cannot do $100 million of business. So what are your 3 4 key risks that if you don't have those things done, and if that incident happens, how much will you lose on a daily or a weekly basis? So you want to be able to say $500 million a year business, high level has a risk of $10 million a day if this particular incident happens. And then some form of uh, and here I don't want to get too prescriptive, but some form of risk score or some form of a notification indication that what is the probability of this particular thing happening. And you can loosely translate the probability of something like that happening based on how many issues you have that today, like threat intelligence based, how many issues do you have that have a high chance of being compromised. And so if you say $500 million business a year business, potential loss of 10 million a day, and there is a 75% chance that an incident could happen in the next few um, months, because we have so many of these open vulnerabilities and issues and stuff like that. uh, then now you are giving the business some form of business thinking context to say, well, okay, I am at 75% potential, and I'm just using that as a loose way from a score perspective, or high or medium, whatever it is. My risk appetite, you cannot speak of risk without an appetite. And so the question then becomes, what is the risk appetite of the business, right? If you're and no, there is no zero risk appetite, and we've seen this over and over again. No matter how much you claim that we completely stop breach or this or that, there is no such thing as zero. So then the question is, what is your risk appetite to bring down the risk up to 20% potential, and say, like, it's not worth spending more money to get it below that, because we can manage with what we have. That's the ideal state. And I don't think, like, more than 95% of the CISOs we talk to are at that point where they can then make that conversation happen. And so uh, ideally that's kind of where you want to go, but there are lots of steps from where people are today, which is just the technical list of, we have all these CVEs, and how do we deal with those CVEs. And I'll give you an example. We did some, so Qualys, we do about 3 billion detections a year in any 12 months of vulnerabilities, as an example. And I asked the team, well, how many of these are CVSS high and critical? Because that's what people focus on. And we found out that over 80% of those were high and critical, because so many people are not even scanning for sometimes things that are lower criticality. So then I said, well, how many of these truly today present a real risk, right? There is the criticality, but is there an exploit available? Is this being used by threat attackers, etc.? And that was roughly about 20%. So if you're just reporting numbers and you're saying, like, oh, we have so many things, no, so then what happens is that the downstream impact of that is what? You are giving the IT team a prioritized list of issues, but if they are taking 5 days to fix all of those issues, they spend 4 days fixing things that did not actually reduce the risk to the business at all, because there never was any risk. And probably they got fatigued, and the last day when they were supposed to actually fix the important ones, they are annoyed and tired. And so how do we uh, ensure that we are really able to say, like, these 5 things cause the maximum risk and these things don't? So there's a lot to unpack here, but the ability for us to say, collect all my risk factors, get threat intelligence to know what actually can be exploited, then see how does that match to my business. Just because I have an exploitable vulnerability that is currently being highly exploited may not necessarily mean it is on an infrastructure that is going to cause a huge loss to me. So I think getting in steps that, so that we get to that point where the language we speak is very important, because the language we speak to the board is a little bit different than to the CEO, which is a little bit different to the CFO, and which is different to the IT team, because the IT team don't want to be, they fix 10,000 things and they get rewarded with 10 more thousand things. They don't feel like they're contributing. If they were like, hey, the score is here, if you fix 5 things, you will be the hero that made the company safer by 50% or something like that, that is more encouraging for them. So everybody has a different language, right? The CFO also at the end of the day is saying, look, where you have limited budget, the IT guy is, or the development team is saying, hey, give me $1 million, we can create this AI project which will maybe increase the business by 20%. And then you have the security person saying, give me $1 million, and I'll make it safer. And then so they're thinking, well, which direction should we go? And that's kind of what you're seeing right now in the last 1 year, where when people say that budgets are being scrutinized and lengthy sales cycles for vendors, is because the justification of the spend in cyber has to be aligned to the business, and that's what everybody's looking for right now.
So I'll jump back in because I still have, like, I've got a ton of stuff, right? Like this could be a 5 hour discussion,
Yeah,
Sumedh. Um,
absolutely.
so we have a lot of background too, and I think one of the things that I've always thought around this is, like, we're doing a disservice, because when we talk to CISOs, we're kind of putting it all on them, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the current chalk track is, hey, you're technical guys, you're not having business conversations. You're not scaled to be able to do this. What are we getting for the value we're putting in? And that conversation is all one way. But the thing I find challenging is I think we really need to have a two-way conversation, right? Because when I go to ask the board, and I've done this multiple times, and I say, what's our risk tolerance, which you brought up, right? It's deer in headlights back, right? It's like, I don't know, like we don't want to get attacked. We like give me zero, right? Like it's like, okay, give me $80 million. And the answer is no. And it's like, well, what do you want to do? And it's like, well, it's really hard to conceptualize when the business can't tell me what the value of the systems I'm protecting. This goes back to IT and infrastructure, right? It's just from an availability side, it's hard to say like, what's the value if this system goes down? Very few companies are able to do that. So I think we're not prepping people and we're not having the real intellectual conversation to enable this. And I think you also mentioned unpacking a lot of stuff here. You also mentioned this concept of being able to attribute and say hey, I'm going to protect this thing, which I think is our crown jewels, and I'm not going to worry about this because it's less valuable. This weekend, the stuff with CrowdStrike was really interesting because I think nobody would have necessarily said, hey, I'm going to deploy this endpoint application and it's going to cause potential problems across my infrastructure. And even worse, I'm protecting the domain controllers. And if I bring down the domain controllers, I can't get things back up because I can't have access to the keys then to generate the fix. And so it's this cascading problem of a systemic risk, which is really hard to conceptualize. So I know that's a lot to unpack. I asked a lot of stuff in a small time frame. But what do you think about like the multi conversation, the bi-directional thing, right? Like having the rest of the e-staff and the board who's up to speed in some fashion, and then allowing the CISO to be that expert, right? And then also this big systemic risk problem, which is really, really hard to quantify and hard to get at. And again, very few companies have done a great job of that. So
Yes, that is a lot, but that is also really because we are at this. And talked to Matt about this as well before. Was like we're at the beginning of this journey, and so there's no risk quantification for dummies book right now, right? Which is like you just follow these three things, and then it's going to be done. I think that what you said is exactly what it is. Is like we have this sort of end goal of where we want to be, and then the question is that brings up where you start with the questions, and we have to start looking for the answers, and you sort of have this like there's technologies out there or framework like FAIR which make it super complicated.
yeah,
On paper, yes, but it's like just doing that itself is a nightmare. And so you want to be able to figure out what it is. And look, I mean, I think more than anybody else, the CISO job is not fair in from any aspect, because and I always say this, that you don't give the CISO the ability to do any remediation. But by the way, when there is a breach, the first person that goes in front of the regulators and the board and whatever is the CISO. It's not the IT person who forgot to patch or didn't patch because they didn't have time. They're not the one saying, hey, never mind, I will go and face the heat. It's always the CISO has to go do that. And I think that's where that's what I talked about, the cultural change, right? Okay, so if you want your CISO to be able to say, talk in terms of business languages, and first, it's not going to happen in one quarter, right? And we saw that when we did it it's a journey, and we saw that when we did it ourselves at our board meeting with Jonathan, started to pivot. First is, and exactly to counter what you said, I always ask Jonathan to really come in and start the meeting not on the defensive, saying how many incidents we had and we handle. I said, first thing you should talk about is how, because of the investment in security and the best practices and the audits that we go through, how every quarter millions of dollars of business is being enabled because of security. Because if we as Qualys don't have the security certifications, and our customers, when they test us, if we don't pass that business is not going to be enabled. And so first start from in being able to say, look, this is the amount of business that we are enabling with the investment that we're making. And then we started pivoting more into, let's stop giving vulnerability counts and just high level update of like, oh, we implemented this best practice. Like today, what I call is like we have the best practices based security. It's not necessarily business context based, but it's like best practices. We should do this, we should do that. And so we pivoted more initially to a score, which was a little bit better for them, because they're like, well, I don't understand these counts, but if you tell me, we are at a high or a critical, that was sort of first step, which took a couple quarters to sort of like say, like, we're going to stop doing the counts, we're going to pivot more towards the score. You have to educate them to say why we're making a change. Then the question after that was, well, it's not a one number for the entire company. It's like we have multiple platforms, and each platform has a certain amount of customers, and each platform then is responsible for a certain amount of revenue. So we started to have those conversations to say, as a business, everybody, the management knows at a high level. You break down what are your main businesses, and then from those you have to start to have that collaboration with your IT team, your finance team, to say, well, at a high level, if you break this down, what are the top 5 businesses that are most important for the company, and go from there. Now, a lot of people say it was impossible to do all of this because there's so many different factors, and what happened this weekend was another example of that. And my response to that always is like with any risk uh, calculation, you can only base it based on what you know right now, or what assumptions that you have made. Does that mean something new that you hadn't thought about might not come up later? Yes, it could come up, and you could be like, well, we never considered that as a risk factor, right? And like when COVID happened, like nobody had considered that something like COVID would be a risk factor to the business, or a tailwind, depending on what your business was. But we have to, my opinion really is, like, we have to start with what we know, the known risk factors. Start from there. It's a journey. 99% of people I know are only reporting vulnerability counts, as an example, or vulnerabilities to the board. But we all know that even if you have a fully patched machine, if the machine is misconfigured, then you have a higher risk of an attack, not less from a CVE than from misconfiguration. How many people actually report misconfiguration issues to their board? So are you really giving a real picture of all the kind of issues
Which
that you have?
is why risk is important, right? It's more the holistic assessment of what's going
Right.
on across the business with regard to security. And I mean, I think you're highlighting a point of, how many CEOs spend time with the CFO, they spend
Right.
time with the sales leader, but do they sit down and spend time to try to help the CISO understand the business and help understand the impacts of security, to your point, to be an enabler for the business?
Exactly. But if you look at the way CEOs think about it, right, like they are looking at, where do I need to invest for top line or bottom line at the end of the day, right? At a
Hmm.
high level, that's what you're looking at. And so that's the, when they're expecting that kind of a response from the CISO or everybody else in the management team, I think uh, it is imperative that I, you have that conversation. The CEOs also need to have that conversation, because if there is an expectation that I need to understand my business from this angle, it is a conversation to have with the CISO to say, look, this is fine. You're giving me one big count, but can we break it down by which country is the most, we have the highest risk, or by which business line do we have the highest risk? And so we can really start to understand that, rather than just, I mean, we do that with for financial risk or other risks, right? Where you really, those are mature risks, and people
Yeah,
have,
it should be no
you
different,
know,
right? I mean, we need to
right,
get
it should be no
aligned in the
different. It's just
same
a risk.
language. Yeah.
But you have, like, those are more mature risk, and there's enough data, and then, because you have to sort of make the decision to say, well, how much should I spend to take it down by myself? How much should I get cyber insurance? And if you look at your, when you buy car insurance as an example, right? Like, and I'm just simplifying it for the sake of an example, but if you always say, well, I drive safe generally, and my car is not that valuable, maybe, so I'm going to go for the higher deductible with a lower monthly premium, right? So what are you doing? You're making that risk trade-off by looking at the various factors of the possibility of the law of the loss and the probability, and then basically saying, look, I think I have enough cash reserve that maybe I will take the chance of a higher cash payout, or something like that. And again, that doesn't exactly apply to security, but the thought process of saying, how much risk do I have, how do I try to reduce how much should I spend to reduce it, how much should I spend to take it off by just using cyber insurance, are the conversations that we are seeing are starting to happen with the board. Because when you go into the board for approval of saying, hey, we're going to buy $20 million of cyber insurance, the first question is that enough?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, even in our conversation, Sumedh, what if I do nothing? Right. I mean, and this ties into the cyber insurance conversation,
What
which
if you
is
self-insure?
right. Or right. And so I think, you've talked that you've had some interesting stories that you shared about, maybe we don't actually mitigate certain risks because I can transfer that risk to cyber insurance. But again, if you're not quantifying, it's really hard to make those decisions.
Yeah,
Well, the
and
lack of maturity, right, is
yeah,
obvious. Like the insurance
yeah.
is a great analogy because I think for a long time, like we've had good actuarial tables on a lot of different risks, but it hasn't existed in the cyber side. So insurance companies have taken a big hit from cyber losses, and we've seen premiums go up, the lack of ability
It
to get coverage,
it act
and so
it
it,
actually
it
it actually exists. Nobody just knows how to use it.
It is, yeah, and so I will agree with Matt. I also was, up to like 2 months ago, Ben, I thought the same. Now, the the cyber insurance company is, it's not as mature as other risk, but they do have data now over a certain period of time, and because that's the question, right? So we had I was talking to one of my buddies who's a CISO, and he's like, hey, look, I took I think they were getting like 20 million cyber insurance for $600,000, and he's like, my CEO asked me, well, how much, like, is that enough, and how do you know? And he said, well, the cyber insurance company told us that it's enough. And so I was like, enough for what? And he said, look, they said 92% of the claims that company your size and in your business will be covered by 20 million for the 600,000. And so, which is 92% of the potential claims. And so then he's like, I got asked, how much are we spending in cyber and tooling and all of that? And it was like 5 million or something like that, right? And so then the CEO was asking, well, so we're paying 600,000 for 92% of the potential issues that can come, but we're paying 5 million for the rest of the 8%. Like, that's the basic equation when you come down to, right? And so the questions he started asking was, well, what if we just spend 1 million in cyber insurance and get more insurance, because that sounds like it's cheaper. Now, obviously, it's not that simple of an equation, but that is how the conversation started to come up. Is It's not a perfect way to do this, but some form of business conversation is what the CEO is going to find a lot more valuable with their CISO, rather than if you just come and present, here's counts and list of things, because it doesn't, what does that mean to the business becomes really the question. And then if you can talk about this, like, overall risk is this much, we are spending this much to take down like 90% of the risk, and then we're going to get cyber insurance for the rest of the 10% of the risk, or whatever it is. Now it's a much more of a business conversation. And obviously you should not have cyber tools. They're super important, but
might be hard to get insurance if you didn't have cyber tools.
well, exactly, right, because they're interconnected, right?
Yeah.
They're interconnected, but to the point that what happened over the weekend, a lot of people disabled the solution that they were using immediately, right? Now, so you make that risk decision at that point to say the risk of continuing to run this solution can cause further availability issues, but that disabling that means that immediately you're exposed to potential cyber attacks. And so in your mind you're saying, yeah, I'll deal with that later. Right now I just need to be back up and running. And so we are constantly always mentally making these risk trade-offs. We're just not thinking specifically in terms of putting it down and speaking in those terms, which is, I think, the cultural changes and conversations that need to happen. And you're right, this is not a one-way conversation where it's like, okay, CISO, go figure this out. There has to be that conversation between the CFO, the CISO, the CEO, on what is it, what's the business, what's the value, what are the key areas that we need to protect, and how do you communicate that to the right stakeholders.
And that common language is money, guys. Like, to me, it's money because they all understand the money side of this. You just have to look at the money in two kind of two sides of that same coin, right? The risk versus the cost to mitigate, right? Or transfer or whatever. But it still, to me, boils down to if we can't quantify this into dollars and cents, it's going to be really hard to have that bi-directional communication, which I think is part of what you meant in that article, Sumedh.
Yeah, it is, and the common language is money, because what are we talking about? We are talking about money, right? We're
Business.
talking about, yeah, we're talking about, by spending this money, I'm going to reduce the potential loss of this much money. That is what cybersecurity is about, right? Like, basically, why are we doing all this cybersecurity tooling, etc., is because it is about the money. Now, when this was a small part, right, it's like sometimes, saying like, oh, I don't know, like, we get food trucks for employees, like, okay, how much does that, can you quantify how much did that help with the business? Well, when it's a smaller part, it was not, there were not that many questions. But as cyber has grown and become so important and such a big part of the business, at a high level, when you're spending millions of dollars in cyber, the question does, come, because it's not the question of, are we spending too much? Honestly, like, the question is also, are we spending enough?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what if we're not spending enough? Just because we implemented a two factor, does that mean we are better protected? And so you also don't want to find that out, right? Like, oh, we should have spent more, and then it's like, well, you never told us that this is an area of risk and we should focus on that, right? So I think the language of money is not a, it's not a forced upon equation. That is exactly what we're talking about right now, which is, I have a business, and the business has certain potential of loss from this particular risk, and then question is, how much should we spend on this risk factor to reduce that, and which is the more important risk factor. And it is not just even at the higher level of communication outside, but even internally, when you are given a certain amount of money, how do you decide where should this money be spent? Is it the vendor that has the best marketing, or is it what you perceive as your biggest risk is what you want to try to mitigate, right? And that is why some form of risk calculation is something that the maturity, we're at the beginning of that maturity curve. And I think as everybody is being asked to speak some form of language, and that's the reason, I told Matt that it was no point getting prescriptive into that, right? It's not like you can't, because every business is at a different part of the journey, and every business is at a different maturity level, and every business may want to talk about it in a slightly different way. But the basic equation comes down to, how much is the business, how much is the potential of loss, what is the probability of that loss, and then how much should I spend to bring that probability down? And nobody is going to say zero. So it's like, how do we get it into an acceptable risk range, which is your risk appetite?
Absolutely. Sumedh, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Of course, thank you guys. Always a pleasure, and this is definitely a very interesting topic. And uh, you guys know we've been doing vulnerability management for a while, uh, but today when we do these conversations and we do these risk workshops with Rich, by the way, and Rich is a lot more of an expert on this than I am. I look at it more from the business standpoint, but we are completely sold out. Like, I mean, we're not charging for it, but just the amount of interest from CISOs right now in this conversation is the highest I've ever seen in anything that we have ever talked about in the last 20 years. So this is clearly on top of mind for everybody. And I think the good thing is it can be a journey that is your own journey, and but you need to start that journey. I think that's very important today, to make that cultural change in the company, where everybody should talk about, question the, what's the risk from this, and then get it to the point where you have some form of communication, risk communication, that works for you and your board and your business. But I think that definitely is something that we need to focus on.
I agree with you 100%. Thank you again. We're going to take a quick break and then welcome Jeff Report to dig deeper into the world of risk management.